Out near the edge of Gila Bend, where the sun scorches the rocks until they crack and the wind smells like dust and dry grass, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary that morning. I'd come out with my camera, hoping to catch the golden light brushing across the canyon ledges. But just past a stretch of rusted fencing, something caught my eye. Something small, trembling in the dirt. At first, I thought it was just a coyote snack left behind. But then I saw the wings, a falcon, not circling above, not perching, standing, protecting. It flared its feathers wide like a living shield over a tiny gray kitten that couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Every time I moved, the falcon hissed and blocked my view. My gut twisted. I knew I had to help, but I also knew this wasn't going to be a normal rescue. Not at all. I crouched in the sand, sweat clinging to my back beneath the camera harness as the falcon's wings sliced the air like blades of living bronze. The sun was only just rising, but already the desert heat shimmered above the rocks in mirage-like waves, distorting everything I saw. Yet there was no mistaking it. This bird, with fierce amber eyes and a blood-rust sheen to its feathers, was not guarding a kill. It was guarding life. The kitten beneath her looked like a ghost of ash, so small it barely seemed real. Its fur clung to brittle bones, and its breath was shallow, twitching like a leaf in the wind. But even from a few feet away, I could see the unmistakable rise and fall of its tiny chest. Sky, as I would later name the falcon, stood firm, body arched protectively over the kitten as though she had birthed it herself. I had seen maternal birds before, seen hawks and owls guard their chicks with brutal grace, but this was something else. This was devotion born of a mystery I didn't understand yet, and it rooted me to the ground in awe and confusion. Slowly I eased backward, not wanting to spook the bird. I pulled out my phone and called Lena. Her voice was still thick with sleep when she picked up, but the moment I mentioned the words kitten, falcon, and guarding, she was fully awake. "Don't touch anything," she warned immediately. "Not until I get there. Raptor's imprint. If she's attached, that's a behavioral anomaly we can't screw with." I knew enough to trust her instincts. She'd seen things in animal rescue I couldn't even name, and when she told me to hold my ground, I did, even as I watched the falcon flick her gaze toward the horizon, feathers rippling in warning. There was something feral in the air, some unspoken tension that pulsed between us like an invisible tether. Me, the bird, the fragile kitten on the ground. We were orbiting something ancient and unseen. Lena arrived 20 minutes later, in her beat-up Jeep, tires grinding gravel as she parked behind a cluster of mesquite. She approached slowly, her long braid tucked under a sun hat, arms held low to avoid startling the bird. "Jesus," she whispered when she saw them. "You weren't kidding." She knelt beside me, eyes scanning the falcon, then the kitten. "It's dehydrated, bad, might have been abandoned by a feral mother, but why this bird is doing this?" Her voice trailed off. She opened her vet bag, prepared a syringe of electrolytes, but when she inched closer, the falcon flared and screeched, talons digging into the dust. Sky was not bluffing. We sat there for what felt like hours, the morning light climbing higher and the desert pressing in. Every time we moved, Sky moved too, circling the kitten, watching us with an intelligence that felt far too human. And in that heat-hazed silence, a question burned inside me louder than any sound. What would drive a predator to protect the weakest thing in the wild? By the time Lena finally managed to coax the falcon away, using nothing but a bowl of water and sheer patience, we both knew we were venturing into territory neither of us had prepared for. Sky didn't fly off in defeat or frustration. Instead, she hovered just above the rocks, circling, calling out in low, rasping cries that weren't quite warning and weren't quite grief either. She kept her eyes on us as Lena scooped up the kitten with the gentlest hands I'd ever seen her use. The moment Ash was lifted from the dirt, his head lolled back limply, and his body folded into her palms like a shadow trying to disappear. The falcon screamed once, sharp and cutting, and then shot skyward, disappearing against the blue with a single, endless beat of her wings. I watched her go, something aching in my chest like I'd just broken a pact I hadn't even agreed to. We rushed Ash back to Lena's clinic, which was just a small converted trailer out by her property, stacked floor to ceiling with crates, worn towels, syringes, and hopeful eyes behind mesh doors. While she laid the kitten down on a heating pad and began an IV drip, I hovered uselessly near the doorway, watching a gecko twitch along the windowsill, trying to quiet the storm in my head. I kept seeing Sky's wings spread wide, her body curved like a shield. The image wouldn't leave me. That wasn't instinct, that was choice. And it didn't make sense. Ash's recovery was slow and uncertain. He wouldn't eat unless hand-fed, and even then, only in the smallest bites. He didn't cry like most kittens, didn't knead or nuzzle. He just stared, silent, fixed, at any shadow that moved across the window. It was like he was waiting for something, or someone. On the second night, while Lena was asleep and I was curled in the corner with my camera gear still beside me, I heard the faintest tapping on the roof. Then wings. I stepped outside into the black stillness of the desert and tilted my head up. There, on the dead branch of a Palo Verde, sat Sky, watching. Always watching. She didn't move when I approached, didn't flinch when I whispered, "He's safe." She only turned her head slightly, eyes catching the moonlight, then vanished into the dark. Over the next few days, Sky came back again and again, perched near the trailer, hovered above the field. Sometimes she brought scraps, half a rabbit, a dead lizard, and dropped them near the porch. Lena was baffled. It's like she thinks she's still feeding him, like he's hers. She shook her head, but there was no science in her voice anymore. Just wonder. Ash, too, began to change, slowly. He tracked her through the window. He stood when her shadow passed. He only slept when she was near. And we were beginning to ask ourselves questions we weren't sure we had the right to answer. It happened on the 6th morning, just as the sun began to spill that pale, syrupy gold across the dry wash behind Lena's property. I was standing on the porch, coffee in hand, trying to steady myself for whatever the day would demand. Ash's feedings, another round of antiseptic wipes, maybe a visit from the shelter rep who'd been hounding Lena about a new intake limit. The air smelled like mesquite and hot iron, and for a moment everything was still. Then I heard it. That same rasping cry, the one Sky had made in the canyon. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from inside the trailer. I dropped the mug. The sound shattered like a gunshot, but I barely noticed. I ran inside, heart hammering, and found Lena already there, frozen in front of Ash's enclosure. The kitten was standing, not staggering or swaying like he had the day before, but standing tall, tail high, body rigid, his mouth slightly open as he let out another rasping cry. It was raw and unnatural, like a falcon's shriek crammed into the lungs of a creature not made for that kind of noise. Lena looked at me wide-eyed. That's not normal," she said, voice brittle. And then it got weirder. Ash began pacing, tight, controlled circles around the towel inside his crate. Not kitten-like shuffling or disoriented swaying, but deliberate, calculating steps, like a bird preparing for flight. "He's mirroring," Lena whispered, crouching slowly. "He's not just bonded to her, he's learning from her." We didn't speak for a long time after that. We just watched. The behavior wasn't constant. Sometimes he slept for hours, barely twitching. Other times he seemed like a different animal altogether. Sharp, alert, almost feral in his intensity. I spent the afternoon going through my field footage, frame by frame, comparing Sky's posture to Ash's movements. There was no mistaking it, he mimicked her. The raised haunches, the slow, head-tilted stare, the arched back before what seemed like a leap but ended in nothing. Something primal was passing between them, something neither of their species was meant to share. And it wasn't just behavior, it was affecting how we treated him. I found myself moving more carefully around Ash, as if startling him might provoke a falcon's rage. Lena, usually the most clinical of us all, had begun whispering to him like he was a wild spirit, something sacred and half-lost. That evening, Tomas Rivera, the falconer from town, finally came by after days of Lena urging him. He took one look at Sky's perch on the fence post and the way Ash turned his head toward her with quiet reverence, and he just whistled low. "You ever hear of cross-species imprinting like this?" Lena asked him. Tomas rubbed the back of his neck and said something I didn't expect. "I've seen birds lose chicks and latch on to things, boots, gloves, even stuffed animals, but never something that looked back at them like that." It was the way he said it, looked back. As if the kitten wasn't just being shaped, but was shaping Sky in return. And somewhere deep in my gut, I felt the balance between them tipping towards something none of us could control. The atmosphere inside the trailer shifted after that morning, like the air itself had become a little heavier with something unspoken. Lena stopped trying to measure Ash's progress with charts and checklists, and Tomas, usually so blunt, so grounded in logic, began visiting every evening without needing to be asked. We didn't talk much anymore while the kitten was awake. It was as if speaking too loud might undo something delicate and ancient that had begun to form between predator and prey. Only this wasn't either of those things anymore. This was something new, something suspended between instinct and intention, and none of us wanted to break the spell. But that didn't mean we agreed on what should happen next. Lena, for all her clinical training and years in vet rescue, had started to believe Ash and Sky shared a kind of imprint bond that couldn't or shouldn't be disrupted. She'd always been rational, pragmatic, but now I caught her watching the two of them with a strange softness in her eyes, like she was witnessing something sacred. She started suggesting we set up a larger enclosure outside, something that would allow Ash to have more space to move while staying close to the Falcon. We shouldn't tear them apart, Miles. He's recovering because of her. She thinks she's his mother. But Tomas didn't see it the same way. To him, Sky was slipping into dangerous territory. A falcon that loses her edge is a falcon that dies, he said one evening as he watched her perch, wings outstretched, silently watching the kitten sleep through the mesh of the window. She stops hunting for herself. She forgets to fear humans. She starts bringing kills to a creature that won't eat them. That's not bonding. That's confusion. I could see the cracks forming between them. Lena wanted to build something around the relationship, preserve it, nurture it. Tomas wanted to dismantle it before it endangered both creatures. And me? I was caught in the middle, tethered to both sides by loyalty and awe. I didn't want to see Ash regress, but I also couldn't bear the thought of Sky being driven off, stripped of the strange bond she had chosen for herself. And yet, as the days passed, even I had to admit that something was changing. Ash was growing stronger, his movements less awkward, his meows returning in small, quiet bursts. But there was also something unplaceably off about him. He didn't engage with the other kittens Lena was fostering. He didn't purr when touched. Instead, he spent his time at the edge of his crate, eyes fixed on the window, waiting for Sky's return like a cub waits for its pack. And every time she landed on that fence post, a hush fell over the room, as if some boundary we didn't understand had just been redrawn again. It became clear we were no longer simply rescuers. We were witnesses to something far more complicated, and none of us were prepared for where it might lead. It was around the second week that the story slipped beyond the edges of our quiet little world and into the mouths of strangers. I should have seen it coming the day Dana showed up. She wasn't the kind of person to take no for an answer. Sharp eyes, faster tongue, a local journalist with a reputation for sniffing out stories in dry riverbeds and backyard chicken coops. Lena hadn't called her, and neither had I. We assumed Tomas had tipped her off, though he swore he hadn't. It didn't really matter. Word had gotten out, and once people caught wind of a kitten raised by a falcon, curiosity turned into spectacle. Dana wanted an exclusive, of course. She arrived with a camera crew and a notebook full of leading questions. Is it love? Survival? Instinct? Is the falcon grieving a lost chick? Is this some kind of imprinting experiment? She spoke like the story was already hers to shape. Lena was quiet, hands folded tightly in her lap, while Tomas stood with his arms crossed, jaw set like a locked gate. I tried to explain what little we knew, that we were observing, not interfering, but every word felt hollow under her gaze. She wasn't listening, she was collecting. By the time her article hit the local news blog, Desert Falcon thinks she's a cat mom, we'd started seeing cars slow roll past Lena's property. One morning, I spotted a kid hopping the fence, phone in hand, trying to get a shot of Sky perched above the trailer. She screamed and flew off before he could get close, and Ash spent the rest of the day crouched in the corner of his enclosure, trembling. That was the first time he hissed at me, and it cut deeper than it should have. Tomas was furious. You wanted to keep them together, he snapped at Lena that night, but now look at what it's become. She's scared. The kitten's overstimulated. You're letting this bond turn into a circus." Lena fired back with just as much heat. "You think tearing them apart will make it better? He needs her. You can't rehome an attachment like this. You'll destroy him." The tension that had once simmered between them now boiled over into every conversation. Even I wasn't spared. They both looked to me for support, and I, stuck in the middle, felt like I was splintering. I saw their points, I felt their fears. But more than that, I saw Ash beginning to change again. Not just physically, but emotionally. He started refusing food from anyone but me. He wouldn't sleep unless the window was open. He cried whenever Sky didn't show up before sunset, pacing like a sentinel cat, trying to summon the sky back into his world. And then came the letter from the county. Someone had reported Lena's property as a site of unlicensed wildlife taming. There would be an inspection within the week. If they deemed Sky a threat or Ash a case of mismanaged wildlife rehabilitation, they could take both. Suddenly, what started as a rescue became a race against a system that didn't understand what we were trying to protect. The night after the county letter arrived, I couldn't sleep. I sat out back with a flashlight balanced between my knees, watching the fence line, half hoping Sky wouldn't come. The thought sat in my chest like a stone. Because if she did come and someone saw her, one of the inspectors or another curious trespasser, we'd lose control of the story completely. But if she didn't come, I didn't know what that would do to Ash, or to me, if I'm honest. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped just photographing the story. I'd stepped into it, barefoot, heart first, and now I didn't know how to back out without tearing something loose inside me. Lena had grown quieter. There was a kind of reverence in how she moved around Ash now. She never touched him without warning, never raised her voice. It was like we were both trying to preserve the air itself, afraid any shift might fracture this bond that made no logical sense but felt more real than anything we'd ever seen in a clinic or textbook. She'd even stopped calling Sky a Falcon. She called her the mother. "She's still watching," she said one morning as we passed the kitchen window. "Even when we can't see her. You feel that, right?" I nodded because I did. Sky was in the silence between sentences, in the way Ash's ears perked before the wind even changed. She was present, even when absent. But Tomas didn't share our reverence. His visits had become shorter, more clipped. He started leaving brochures for wildlife sanctuaries on the kitchen counter, sending me links to raptor relocation programs. "There are places that can handle this better," he said. "Places with real infrastructure, a staff, behavioral specialists." What he didn't say, but what I heard anyway, was that we were amateurs, that our emotion was blinding us, that we were risking the Falcon's life and the kitten's because we were too attached to a story that maybe never should have started. I snapped at him one evening, told him to stop acting like he was the only one with perspective, that we'd been here every day, feeding and cleaning and watching this unfold, not from a distance, but inside it. He just looked at me and said, "And maybe that's the problem." That night, I stayed up with Ash again. He curled against the window, his tiny body tense and still, his eyes fixed on the night sky as if willing her to return. I sat on the floor beside him, not saying anything, just breathing with him, wondering if he could hear my heartbeat and if it sounded anything like wings in the distance. And in that stillness, the question kept coming back, not what's best for him or for her, but for both. Because I'd started to realize they weren't two animals anymore. They were a unit, a single equation we didn't know how to solve without subtracting something vital, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough to choose who to let go of. The day Sky didn't come was the day everything shifted, subtly but irrevocably. The sky held the same hue of desert blue, the wind pressed low against the brush, and Ash still pressed himself to the window like clockwork, but her shadow never passed. No wings cut through the light, no distant screech split the horizon. The stillness wasn't peaceful, it was loaded, as though even the birds had chosen not to speak. Ash waited for hours, unmoving. When the sun began to dip and her shape still hadn't graced the fence post, he let out the softest sound, a whimper so unlike his usual cries it barely registered as a meow. It was the sound of something unraveling. I stayed with him that night, my eyes flicking between the sky and the clock until the numbers blurred. Still no sky. And then, just past 2 a.m., Lena burst into the trailer holding her phone like it was a lit flare. "She's hurt," she said. "They found her." Apparently, a wildlife tracker upstate had spotted a grounded falcon limping along the side of a rural road, talon tangled in some kind of synthetic netting. It was Sky. There was no mistaking the band on her leg, the chest pattern, or the odd scar above her left eye. They'd picked her up and transported her to a sanctuary outside Prescott. "She's stable," Lena said, her voice shaking, "but grounded, might not fly for a while." She looked at Ash, who now lay curled into a perfect silent circle. "We need to tell him," she whispered. I didn't say a word because how do you explain to a kitten that the sky is broken? We drove out 2 days later against Tomas's advice. He'd called the sanctuary ahead of time and arranged for us to visit, just observe, nothing more. "They're handling it," he told us. "Let them." But letting go wasn't an option. Not for us, not anymore. The sanctuary was tucked into a rocky valley surrounded by fencing and low hums of wind turbines. Sky was housed in a shaded enclosure lined with perches and straw, her wing partially bound, one eye dulled by exhaustion. But when she saw us, she shifted, just slightly, her gaze sharpened. And when Lena held Ash up, wrapped in his fleece blanket like a living relic, Sky let out a long, low chirr that sounded almost like mourning. Ash responded with a faint, breathy purr. His first. I felt it vibrate through the air like a secret they hadn't meant to share aloud. We weren't allowed to let him close. Sanctuary rules, disease control, trauma boundaries, all valid. But standing there, with wire mesh between two creatures who had no language in common and yet understood each other better than we ever could, I realized this wasn't just a rescue anymore. This was a bond we didn't create. We were just the ones trying not to break it. And somewhere in that moment, I knew something bigger was coming. Something that would force us to choose. The days after the sanctuary visit felt unreal, like waking up and realizing the dream you just left was more honest than anything in your waking life. I kept replaying that moment at the fence, Ash's soft purr vibrating through the towel, Sky's head tilt, that look between them that felt like a goodbye neither wanted to admit. Lena tried to distract herself with clinic work. Tomas kept his distance, calling only to check in, though I could hear in his voice that his interest hadn't waned. If anything, he was waiting for something. A crack in the story, a sign that this bond had been more burden than miracle. But what none of us expected was how Ash began to change in Sky's absence. It started small. He stopped circling his enclosure and began pressing himself against its edges, as if testing its boundaries. He became restless, ignoring his toys and swatting at anything that blocked his view of the sky. He meowed more, not in distress, but insistently, as if calling out, trying to trigger something in the wind. And when Lena took him outside in her arms for the first time since the visit, he became still, utterly, completely still, as if breathing in the desert air was somehow aligning him with something he had been missing. "He's sinking to her," she said softly, almost like it was a confession. Even without her here, he's attuned to whatever rhythm she left behind. It was hard to argue. He'd grown, yes, stronger, more alert, but he'd also become other. I watched as he climbed, higher and more recklessly than the other kittens his age. He perched on windowsills, fences, the backs of chairs, tail flicking, eyes narrowed, not with feline mischief but with avian calculation. When the wind picked up, he leaned into it. When shadows crossed overhead, he froze. Sometimes at dusk, he'd stare at the open sky for hours, silent and unblinking, until the first star appeared. Lena documented everything, filling notebooks with observations and sketches, trying to convince herself this could still be explained, quantified. But I could tell she was starting to believe what I already felt in my bones. This was not about behavior anymore. This was connection. Deep, strange, inconvenient connection. Then came the message from the sanctuary. Sky was healing faster than expected. She might be ready for release within a few weeks. The news hit harder than I thought it would. Not because we feared for her survival, she was built of wind and willpower, but because it raised the question none of us had dared to ask. What happens to Ash when she's gone for good? Will he search for her, wait, forget, or worse, refuse to move on? Tomas was clear. She needs to be released, period. She's not a pet, she's not his mother, she's a falcon. But Lena didn't answer him. She just sat on the porch with Ash curled at her feet, both of them staring out into the waning light, like they shared the same thought. I didn't ask what it was. I already knew. We were no longer wondering what was best for the animals. We were wondering if we were strong enough to do it. The morning the release date was finalized, I watched Ash for over an hour before saying a word. He'd taken to sleeping beneath the screened window, where the scent of the outside drifted in with the morning breeze. His ears twitched with every passing bird call. His tail moved in rhythm with the breeze, like a metronome, ticking off moments none of us could slow down. The sanctuary had called at dawn. Sky was ready. She'd made a full recovery, her flight strong, her instincts sharp. They wanted to release her back into the wild that weekend, up north where she was found, far from any human settlement. She's returned to herself, they said. She no longer circles the enclosure or waits near the gate. She's ready to be wild again. But Ash wasn't. When I told Lena, she didn't speak for a long time. She just rested her hand on Ash's back, her thumb brushing through the short fur behind his neck. Finally, she whispered, "Then we can't let them do it." I felt my chest tighten, not in surprise, but in recognition. The feeling had been growing in both of us, silent and unwelcome, a resistance to logic, a selfish tether made of emotion and wonder. It wasn't about keeping her in a cage or turning Ash into a symbol of something extraordinary. It was about protecting what they had, a bond that had become something neither natural nor wrong, but real. Tomas, of course, exploded when we told him. "You want to stop the release? On what grounds? That a kitten is lonely? That a falcon might miss him?" His voice was sharp enough to splinter wood. "You're not gods. You don't own this story." Lena didn't flinch. "We don't want to keep her," she said. "We want to give them the chance to choose, that's all." But Tomas wasn't hearing it. "They're animals," he snapped. "You're romanticizing instinct and turning it into fantasy." But was it fantasy? I watched Ash nudge the corner of the door every time it opened, saw the way he grew still and alert when he heard falcon calls in the distance, calls that no longer belonged to Sky. I had seen grief in animals before, seen it in dogs and horses and elephants. What we were witnessing wasn't confusion. It was longing, recognition, a tether unbroken, and yet the truth was unrelenting. We couldn't keep them together forever. One was born to roam the skies, the other had just begun to walk on steady paws. There was no world where they could exist side by side indefinitely. Something would have to give, or someone. It was Lena who proposed the impossible. "Let's ask them," she said, her voice steady in a way that made my skin prickle. "Let's bring Ash to the release, not in the crate, outside. Let him see her go. Let her see him. If she leaves, it's done. But if she stays..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. We all knew that whatever happened next would define the rest of the story, for them and for us. The desert near Prescott that morning felt different, emptier somehow, as if the earth itself had drawn in a breath and was holding it, waiting for what we might do. The sanctuary had chosen a ridge lined with sandstone outcrops and wild scrub, a place quiet enough for release, but remote enough that no curious eyes would interrupt. We arrived just after sunrise, the sky painted in soft tones of apricot and rust. I could feel the sun warming my neck as I stepped out of the truck with Ash tucked into the sling across my chest, his tiny heart fluttering like a second pulse against mine. The team from the sanctuary wasn't pleased. They were professionals, efficient, clinical, unimpressed by sentiment. They hadn't expected us to bring Ash at all, let alone with the intention of letting him out. "This isn't protocol," the lead handler said flatly, arms crossed, face unreadable beneath her wide-brimmed hat. "This isn't safe. This is..." "It's a chance," Lena cut in. "Just a few minutes. We don't interfere. We observe." There was tension in the air, the kind that doesn't crack but hums, low and dangerous, like heat rising before a storm. Tomas wasn't even speaking. He stood a little ways back, arms folded, face set in stone. I hadn't seen him that still since the day we found Ash. Sky had already been brought out, housed temporarily in a large wire travel enclosure overlooking the slope. The moment we arrived, she reacted. Her head snapped toward us, wings shivering slightly, her body suddenly charged. The sound she made, it wasn't the high, piercing cry of the hunt. It was low, searching, almost intimate. Ash stiffened in my arms. Then he let out a meow, one I'd never heard before. It wasn't a kitten's cry, not fully. It was guttural, short, laced with something older. And in that moment, every doubt I'd had shattered into dust. We opened the sling. He didn't bolt. He climbed out slowly, nose twitching, paws patting over the red dirt with uncertain purpose. He looked like he didn't quite belong to this world or hers, caught in a space between, but moving forward all the same. We set him down 20 feet from Sky's enclosure. The handlers opened her gate and stepped back. No one spoke. No one moved. Sky emerged slowly, feathers lifted slightly, wings half open, not in threat but in recognition. She made a low sound again, a pulse, a call. Ash responded by sitting, curling his tail around his paws and simply watching. No fear, no tension, just presence. It wasn't what we expected. She circled once, twice. The sky was wide open behind her and we all held our breath. Then she paused, turned, and stepped forward, just a few paces, and Ash impossibly rose to meet her. They stood there, not touching, not moving, but connected. Everything else, the sanctuary, the arguments, the science, the rules, all faded. It was just them. And a question so quiet it didn't need to be asked aloud. Would she stay, or would he let her go? Time didn't move the way it was supposed to in that moment. It stretched, quiet and taut, like the silence before a string snaps. The sun had crept a little higher, throwing long, fractured shadows across the sandstone, but still no one spoke. Even the sanctuary team, normally so composed and procedural, stood still, watching with a reverence they'd never admit. Lena barely breathed beside me. Her hand was wrapped so tightly around her wrist I could see the whites of her knuckles. Tomas remained behind us, stone-faced but watching, always watching. None of us knew what to expect now. We'd prepared for a decision, but not for this. Sky didn't take flight, not immediately. Instead, she stood there, her talons sunk gently into the red earth, wings twitching slightly at her sides. She looked different out here, less like a wild thing, and more like something ancient, something stitched into the land itself. Her eyes weren't scanning the sky or searching for prey. They were locked on Ash, quiet and unmoving beneath her gaze. And Ash in turn didn't move either. His back was straight, ears forward, body tense, but not in fear. He wasn't crouching or hiding or trying to run. He was waiting. The air shifted. A breeze slid through the scrub and bent the grasses at the edge of the clearing. It carried the scent of sage and dust, the rustle of wings somewhere far off. Sky's feathers rose with it, a silent reaction. She blinked once, slowly, and then with a graceful step that seemed too soft for a raptor of her size, she moved closer. Not swooping, not aggressive, just walking. 4 paces, 5. Then she stopped. Ash rose slightly onto his front paws, his tail curling behind him. Their shadows nearly touched. I felt it in that second, that deep, aching knowledge that we had reached the center of something that had been building not for days or weeks, but lifetimes. A moment that didn't care about cages or rules or logic. It was as if every choice we'd made, every decision to wait, to intervene, to let things unfold, had been leading here. And still, it wasn't ours. This wasn't our story anymore. We were just the ones who'd been privileged enough to witness it. But still, beneath all the awe of something cracked inside me. Because I knew what was coming. Sky looked skyward, just once. Her body coiled, her wings arched wide, catching the light like burnished silver. The air around her changed, became electric. Ash tensed, his eyes never leaving hers. I saw his muscles twitch, but he didn't follow, didn't move. And then, she rose. She rose, not explosively, not urgently, but with the kind of grenade you believe gravity had lost its hold on her entirely. Her wings beat once, twice, and she began to climb. Ash turned his head to follow her, his body still, his gaze never breaking. And as her form grew smaller against the sky, the wind kissed the back of my neck, and I finally exhaled. But Ash didn't. He just sat there, watching, waiting, as if she might still turn around. Ash didn't move for hours after Sky disappeared into the sky. We waited there on that ridge with the sun climbing and falling around us, the heat pressing down in waves and the wind kicking red dust across our boots. The sanctuary team eventually packed up. They left quietly, without saying much, maybe sensing there was nothing more to supervise. Lena tried once to pick Ash up, but he pulled away, not with panic or aggression, just with that slow, purposeful shift that said, "Not yet." So we let him be. It wasn't until the edge of dusk, when the light softened into that burnished color it gets right before dark, that he stood up on his own. He didn't meow. He didn't look around. He just walked back toward us, slow and steady, like someone who'd made up their mind. I crouched, arms out, and he let me lift him. His body was warmer than usual, his heartbeat steady against my palm, and when I carried him back to the truck, he didn't squirm or protest. He rested his head against my arm and closed his eyes. I think we all knew then, Sky had gone, and this was his way of saying he understood. It didn't mean it hurt any less, but it meant he was ready to carry it. The ride home was silent. No one filled the quiet with observations or theories. Lena stared out the window, her fingers curled around Ash's carrier like she needed something to hold on to. Tomas drove. He didn't say a word, but the fact that he was the one behind the wheel told me he understood more than he let on. Back at the trailer, Ash walked out of the crate on his own and went straight to the window, the same one he'd spent days watching before. He jumped onto the sill, curled up in the corner, and went still. From time to time, he looked up, but not as often, not like before. The weeks that followed weren't easy. He grieved in a way that was quiet and patient. He didn't regress, not physically. He ate, drank, grew. But emotionally, he moved like someone learning how to be alone. Lena stayed close to him. So did I. Sometimes at night, I'd catch her sitting next to his window, whispering stories she used to tell him when he was too small to keep his eyes open. She never mentioned Sky, not out loud, but I saw it in the way she left the window cracked just enough for the night air to slip in. And Ash, he never stopped listening. One morning I found him playing with one of the younger Fosters. Gently, curiously, like he was learning to be a cat for the first time. No more circling, no more stillness. He moved differently now. He was still a little apart from the others, still quiet, but not lost, not waiting. Sky had flown, and he had stayed. And in that, both had chosen. Ash never forgot her. That much I can say with certainty. Even now, months later, when the nights grow still and the wind shifts across the desert in a certain way, I'll catch him staring out the window with that same quiet attention, the kind that isn't just looking but waiting. He doesn't cry for her. He doesn't pace or call. But there's a weight behind his eyes that reminds me how much he saw in those few weeks, how much he carried from something we'll never fully understand. Life moved forward around him. The younger cats he once ignored now curl beside him on the blanket Lena keeps near the heater. He eats without fuss. He plays sometimes, though still with that strange sense of purpose in his movements, like everything he does means a little more than it should. And though he's clearly one of them now, part of the clumsy, warm chaos of the Fosters, there's always that small piece of him that stays apart. Not out of fear or sadness, just difference. He was shaped by something most animals never know. Most people either. Lena kept her notes, dozens of pages filled with sketches, timestamps, behavioral records. At first, she said she might write a paper, might send it to a veterinary journal, or present it at a wildlife rehab conference. But the more time passed, the less interested she became in proving what happened. Some things aren't meant to be dissected, she said one night while watching Ash sleep. Some things just happen, and maybe that's the point. Tomas still checks in, less often now. He never apologized, and he didn't have to. He was trying to do right by a wild thing, and in many ways he did. Sky got what she needed, a full recovery, a second chance at the life she was made for. No tracking collar, no sanctuary cage, just the sky. I ask about her sometimes, and he says she hasn't returned to the area. But I wonder if somewhere in the cliffs north of here, a falcon still flies low over the ridgelines when the light hits just right. Not searching, just remembering. As for me, I still take pictures, but not of moments I expect to explain. I don't need to capture everything anymore. Some stories are meant to be lived once, then carried quietly, like a memory you don't bring out often but feel every time you reach for it. Ash is part of that now, so is Sky. Not because their story had a perfect ending. It didn't. It never could. But it had truth. It had choice. And maybe that's the lesson in all this. Rescue doesn't always mean saving something. Sometimes it means witnessing it, holding space for something wild and impossible, and letting it shape you, even when it's over. So when people ask me what happened out there, what it really was between that kitten and that falcon, I just say this: they found each other. That was enough. If this story made you feel something, confusion, awe, maybe even a quiet ache, then I hope you'll sit with that for a moment. Not everything in life fits into a clean category. Sometimes we're just lucky enough to witness something we can't explain. If you've ever rescued an animal or been rescued by one in your own way, you already understand what I mean. If you want to hear more stories like this, real, strange, beautiful ones, subscribe or just leave a comment. I'd love to hear if anything like this has ever happened to you. And if not, maybe one day it will, because sometimes the wild chooses you.